Imagine stepping into the hushed shadows of a towering cathedral in medieval England. The year is 1236. Morning sunlight pours through stained glass, scattering rainbow patterns across the cold stone floor. The air hangs heavy with incense, thick with the murmured prayers of nobles gathered for what should be a moment of celebration. Yet if you look closely at the young bride before the altar, you'll see something that makes your blood run cold. Her hands tremble, not with joy, but with sheer terror. This is Eleanor of Provence, barely 13 years old. Beside her stands King Henry III of England, a man twice her age and a stranger she has never laid eyes on until this very moment, when he lifts her veil. Her father's signature on a marriage contract had already stolen her childhood, and now she stands here knowing the cruel truth. Within hours, she will face something far more frightening than any battlefield or plague: her wedding night. Forget the polished fairy tales of Disney or the glamorous love stories of costume dramas. The reality of medieval royal marriages was stark and brutal. Girls scarcely out of childhood were bartered like livestock to men old enough to be their fathers. What should have been private and intimate became public spectacle, and wedding nights weren't tender beginnings. They were ordeals of survival that could leave a girl broken or even dead. This is the unvarnished truth of why medieval queens dreaded their wedding nights more than death itself. These aren't stories of nervous brides with cold feet. They are accounts of children forced into situations they couldn't begin to comprehend, of girls who knew that the bedchamber could be the most dangerous place they'd ever enter. Before we uncover these lost stories of fear and endurance, if you enjoy exploring the hidden corners of history, consider subscribing for more and drop a comment let in. Let me know where you're listening from. It amazes me how these forgotten voices of the past bring us together across centuries, connected by curiosity and a shared desire to know the truth. The first thing you need to understand about medieval royal marriages is that love played no part in them. These weren't unions chosen by two willing partners. They were cold transactions, political bargains, financial deals, and breeding contracts. A bride's feelings weren't just ignored, they were seen as obstacles. Picture yourself as a noble daughter, perhaps 10 or 11, still clutching dolls or learning to stitch when your father summons you. He doesn't ask your opinion, he doesn't care for your consent. He simply informs you that you're promised to a man you've never met, in a country you've never seen, for reasons you're too young to grasp. From that moment, your childhood is over. Margaret Bowett understood this before she even turned 7. At just 6 years old, she was betrothed to John Diol, the son of the Duke of Suffolk. By 9, shifting politics meant her engagement was broken, and she was handed instead to Edmund Tudor. No one asked her what she wanted, no one ever would. Her worth wasn't measured by her mind, her kindness, or her dreams. It was measured in acres of land, in alliances forged, and in the children she might bear. The weight of this system scarred these girls long before they ever walked to the altar. They grew up knowing their bodies weren't theirs, their futures were written in distant castles, and that one day they'd be delivered into the hands of a stranger with absolute power over them. They lived in constant dread, never knowing when the call would come or what kind of man awaited them. And yet even the marriage itself was only the beginning. The true nightmare began with the bedding ceremony, a tradition so invasive, so dehumanizing, that by today's standards it could only be described as torture. This was not the tender privacy of two newlyweds beginning a life together. It was something far more disturbing, a ritualized spectacle, where the most intimate moment of marriage was transformed into public entertainment. The bedding ceremony, as it was known, stripped away any notion of romance or dignity. Instead, it turned the bedroom into a stage, and the bride and groom into unwilling performers for an audience that ranged from close relatives to utter strangers. The ritual began as the wedding feast came to an end. Laughter, drinking, and merrymaking gave way to a grim procession. The bride and groom were escorted to their chamber by a throng of guests, family members, friends, nobles of every rank, and often complete outsiders who had no personal connection to the couple at all. They crowded into the room, jostling and jeering, determined to witness what was supposed to be a sacred and private act. For the young couple, often little more than frightened adolescents, the ordeal began with forced undressing. Guests would egg them on with crude jokes, sharp laughter, and mocking advice. The bride, trembling and humiliated, was made to remove her garments under the relentless gaze of dozens of eyes. In many cases, the clothing was torn from her body and flung about the room in a frenzy of bawdy energy. The atmosphere was anything but solemn. Guests made lewd remarks about the bride's body, comparing her youth or fragility to livestock, or speculating loudly on how she might fare in bed. The supposed purpose of this ceremony was to usher the couple into their new life together, but in truth it resembled more of a carnival, a grotesque circus of humiliation where intimacy was no longer the property of two individuals, but of an entire community. For ordinary marriages, the ceremony ended with the guests withdrawing once the couple had been placed into bed, but for royal unions the intrusion went even further. These marriages were not just personal commitments, they were political alliances, instruments of diplomacy, and insurance policies for dynasties. The consummation of the union was not simply expected, it was required, and it had to be witnessed. Political futures hinged on the production of legitimate heirs, so witnesses were tasked with verifying that the marriage had been properly sealed. This meant that the performance did not end when the curtains were drawn. In some cases, the curtains were never drawn at all. Guests, often nobles or officials with vested interests, remained in the room. They stood at the foot of the bed, peered from behind drapery, or positioned themselves in corners to ensure that what was supposed to happen did, in fact, take place. The bride's tears, her cries of pain, her fear and trembling, all of it became evidence. Her body was no longer her own, it was public property, examined and discussed as if she were no more than a breeding animal in a royal stable. To imagine this horror more clearly, one must remember the age of many of these brides. These were not grown women making choices for themselves. They were children, some of them barely past their 8th birthday. Imagine an 8-year-old girl today, small and fragile, being forced to marry a grown man and share his bed under the watchful gaze of dozens of adults. The idea is monstrous, and yet in medieval courts it was considered not only normal, but essential. The dignity of a child meant little compared to the demands of politics. The record of English queens alone reveals the pattern. Isabella of Valois was married to King Richard II at only 8 years old. 8. Her marriage was celebrated with pomp and grandeur, but behind the pageantry was the unbearable truth that a child was being prepared for a role she could not understand. Eleanor of Provence was only 13 when she married Henry III. Margaret of Anjou, later celebrated for her political influence, was just 15 when she became the wife of Henry VI. Anne of Bohemia, Richard II's first wife, was also 15 when she was wed. These were not unusual stories, they were the standard path for royal daughters. The justification was always the same: political necessity. Families could not afford to wait until their daughters were emotionally or physically mature. The girls were bargaining chips, their value measured in alliances, treaties, and territorial claims. But the medical realities make the practice all the more horrific. In the medieval period, girls did not typically reach menarche until around 16, several years later than is common today. This meant that many child brides were being pushed into sexual situations long before their bodies were even capable of pregnancy. The pressure to produce heirs began almost immediately, and husbands often showed little patience for the so-called waiting period that was supposed to protect very young brides from sexual consummation until they were older. The story of Margaret Beaufort illustrates this brutality in stark detail. Married at 12 to Edmund Tudor, a man 24 years her senior, she was supposed to wait until she reached maturity before the marriage was consummated. But Edmund had no interest in waiting. His eyes were fixed on her vast inheritance, and he knew that producing an heir would secure his claim to her lands. So, he forced himself upon her, again and again, until she became pregnant. What followed was nothing short of systematic violation, sanctioned by custom and reinforced by law. Margaret gave birth at just 13, her young body permanently damaged by the ordeal. Though she survived, the experience haunted her for the rest of her life, and she would never again be able to bear another child. This was the hidden face of medieval royal marriage. Behind the glittering ceremonies, the banquet halls, the gold embroidery and crowns, there was terror, there was trauma, And most often there were children at the centre of it all. These young brides were not seen as people with hopes, fears, and innocence worth protecting. They were seen as tools, as vessels for dynastic ambition. Their bodies were battlegrounds for politics, and their suffering was brushed aside as an acceptable cost for securing the future of a kingdom. The bedding ceremony may have been celebrated as a tradition, even as a source of entertainment, but for the girls, forced to endure it, it was a nightmare. Stripped, mocked, humiliated, and often assaulted before they had even reached womanhood. Their first night of marriage was not the beginning of a happy union, but the loss of any claim to privacy, safety, or dignity. It was a ritual that revealed in the starkest terms how little value was placed on the humanity of women, especially young women, in the pursuit of political power. Margaret's own words later in life betrayed just how deep the wounds of her first marriage ran. She recalled endless nights spent staring into the darkness, sleepless and afraid, her thoughts circling in helpless rage. She had been little more than a child, caught in a nightmare designed by adults, with no escape, no comfort, and no say in her own fate. When Edmund Tudor, her husband, died suddenly of plague less than a year after their union, he left behind not only a 13-year-old widow, but also a child bride who was already carrying his heir. Margaret herself was still a child when her labour began, and what followed was an ordeal that nearly ended her life. Her confessor later described her survival as nothing short of a miracle, marvelling that someone so small, so slight, could have possibly brought a baby into the world. The trauma of that birth scarred her for the rest of her life. Though she would marry twice more, she never bore another child. The damage inflicted on her body at 13 was irreversible. Her story was tragic, but it was not unique. It was not even unusual. It was the expected consequence of a system that reduced girls to breeding stock, to vessels for dynastic ambition. Young queens entered their marriage chambers with full knowledge of what might await them: forced consummation, pregnancies their bodies were unprepared for, and the very real chance of death in childbirth. Their fears were not the wild imaginings of nervous children. They were rational calculations, grounded in the cold realities of their time. Every girl in that position knew that what she dreaded most might very well come to pass. But the agony of these marriages was not confined to the physical. If their bodies bore the brunt of forced unions and premature childbirth, their minds bore scars just as deep. The psychological toll of these arrangements was crushing. Many of these young queens lived in a state of constant dread. They did not know if their husbands would treat them with kindness or cruelty, whether their new homes would offer safety or hostility. They were alone in foreign courts, separated from their families and surrounded by strangers who did not see them as daughters, sisters, or children, but as political investments. Their tears, their pleas, their pain, all of it was irrelevant compared to the role they were expected to play. The system was designed to reshape them, to take frightened children and mould them into compliant wives whose duty was to produce heirs without question, without hesitation, without protest. The wedding night was not just a horrifying initiation, it was the beginning of a process of breaking them down, stripping away their individuality, their will, their sense of self. These girls were meant to emerge not as people, but as instruments, their identities erased by the demands of dynastic survival. And the nightmare did not end once the guests left the bedchamber. In truth, the wedding night was only the first act. What followed in the cold light of morning was often just as terrible. Imagine a 13-year-old queen waking after her first sexual experience, sore, bleeding, and emotionally shattered. Instead of rest, she would be subject to examination. Court physicians or attendants would arrive to verify the consummation. The bedclothes would be inspected for blood, as though her pain and humiliation were not proof enough. Her body, already violated, would be prodded and examined by strangers. Every detail of what had transpired would be documented, preserved in official records, her most private agony transformed into public evidence. From that point forward, her life was no longer her own. Her body became the property of the crown, a subject of scrutiny and surveillance. Queens were not simply wives, they were living wombs, their worth measured almost entirely by their ability to produce sons. Every aspect of their existence was monitored with this purpose in mind. Their menstrual cycles were charted, their meals were overseen by watchful attendants, looking for changes that might signal pregnancy. Privacy was nearly impossible. Even in their chambers they were surrounded by servants whose duty was not loyalty, but observation. The pressure to conceive was relentless. A queen was expected to prove her fertility almost immediately. If she failed to become pregnant within a year, whispers began to spread. Was she barren? Was she cursed? Was God punishing her, or had she committed some hidden sin? The court's whispers grew louder with each passing month, and the suspicion often turned cruel. If the king's eye wandered, the queen might be accused of infidelity. If an heir did not arrive quickly enough, she might face annulment, disgrace, or even exile. Margaret of Anjou's story is one of the clearest examples of this suffocating pressure. Married to Henry VI at the age of 15, she endured 8 long years of marriage before she finally gave birth to a son. For nearly a decade, she was trapped in a cycle of disappointment and despair. Month after month, her body was examined, her fertility questioned, her future as queen placed under a shadow of doubt. Each missed opportunity was treated not as a private sorrow, but as a public failure. Every cycle without conception invited whispers of divine disfavour, or speculation that she was somehow defective, unfit to fulfil the single duty expected of her. The cruelty of the system lay in its utter indifference to the humanity of these young girls. Their terror, their pain, their youth, all of it was irrelevant beside the political necessity of producing heirs. For them, the wedding night was not an isolated trauma, but the overture to a lifetime of suffering. It was the moment they crossed into a world where their choices no longer mattered, where their bodies were no longer their own, and where each dawn brought with it new burdens and new reasons to be afraid. And so, when we look back at these stories, we must see them not as quaint traditions or distant curiosities, but as human tragedies. Behind the gilded crowns and jewelled gowns were frightened children who lived lives dictated by politics and plagued by fear. The true horror was not only what happened behind closed doors on a single night, but the knowledge that for many of these young queens, that night was only the beginning of a life stripped of control, dignity, and freedom. When Margaret of Anjou finally gave birth to Edward of Westminster, the relief was so overwhelming that she is said to have wept uncontrollably, not with joy, but with exhaustion and release. Her tears were the kind that come when unbearable. The pressure finally breaks. For years she had been treated as little more than a vessel, and the weight of expectation had nearly crushed her. The birth of a son meant that she had at last fulfilled the role for which she had been bartered and sold. It was not triumph she felt, but the weary recognition that she had delivered what everyone around her demanded, and that, for the moment, she was safe. The dangers she had faced were not imagined. Childbirth in the medieval world was a gamble with death. Without anesthesia, antiseptic, or any understanding of infection, labour was a brutal ordeal that often claimed both mothers and children. For women, it was one of the leading causes of death, and for queens, the dangers were compounded by the cold reality of politics. The physicians summoned to assist them were often less concerned with preserving the mother's life than with ensuring the survival of the baby, particularly if the child was male. A queen's body was regarded as a tool for producing heirs. Once she had performed that duty, her own survival was secondary. Eleanor of Provence, married to Henry III at the age of 13, trembled as a child bride at the altar, but her true ordeal began a few years later. She gave birth to her first child at 16, after 3 days of agonizing labor. She nearly bled to death, and for a time it was uncertain whether she would survive. Yet before her body had time to recover, she was expected to conceive again. Within months she was once more pregnant, because the dynastic need for multiple heirs outweighed any concern for her health or recovery. Over the course of her life she bore 5 children, each pregnancy shadowed by the risk of death, each birth an event that reminded her that her body was never her own. She faced these ordeals not with joy, but with the resigned endurance of someone who understood that her life belonged to the crown and the dynasty it served. The psychological burden of such reproductive servitude was immense. These queens lived in perpetual dread of pregnancy, knowing that every conception might end their lives, Fear clung to them like a shadow. Many developed elaborate rituals and superstitions in an effort to protect themselves. They prayed fervently to saints reputed to safeguard women in childbirth, wore charms and amulets against miscarriage, and submitted to medical practices that were often little more than dangerous quackery. Herbal concoctions, bloodletting, and bizarre rituals offered little real relief, but they gave the illusion of control in a world where they had none. Some queens, in desperation, tried to avoid pregnancy altogether. Crude forms of birth control or primitive contraceptive methods were occasionally attempted, but for a queen, such acts were dangerous in themselves. A royal wife who deliberately sought to prevent conception was considered guilty not only of defying her husband, but of betraying the kingdom. Her womb was property of the crown, and to deny it was treason. The punishment could be as severe as imprisonment or even execution, depending on the political climate and the temper of the king. Even rumours of such actions could destroy a queen's reputation, turning courtiers against her and branding her as faithless or unnatural. Yet perhaps the most crushing element of their existence was not the physical peril or even the political surveillance, but the profound loneliness. These girls were taken from their homes and dispatched to foreign lands, often without friends or confidants, and thrust into courts where they were strangers. They had to navigate alien customs, new languages, and households filled with people who regarded them not as children in need of comfort, but as investments to be managed. The language barrier alone was a source of terror. Imagine being 13 years old, already traumatized by a wedding night that had stripped away all sense of safety, and then finding that you cannot even express yourself. You cannot ask questions, cannot plead for mercy, cannot communicate your needs. Every word spoken around you is unfamiliar, every servant a stranger, every instruction incomprehensible. Even the man to whom you are now bound is foreign to you, speaking in a tongue that may as well belong to another world. Isabella of Valois, the child queen married to Richard II at only 8 years old, endured exactly this. She was plucked from her home in France and deposited in England, stripped of her companions and surrounded by English courtiers who saw her not as a frightened child but as a political prize. When she clung to her French identity, speaking her native language or maintaining familiar customs, she was scolded, mocked, and told to conform. Bit by bit, her culture, her habits, and her very sense of self were eroded, replaced by whatever the English court deemed suitable for its queen. The surviving correspondence of these queens reveals the depth of their anguish. Their letters are filled with longing, their homesickness so profound it made them physically ill. Some wrote of sleepless nights haunted by nightmares, others of the sense that they were constantly watched, judged, and measured by people who had no interest in their well-being. Buried between the lines are coded pleas for rescue, veiled appeals to fathers, brothers, or mothers for familiar faces to be sent to their side. Again and again the letters convey regret for marriages that had severed them from their childhoods, regret for the lives they might have led had they not been traded like commodities between courts. As these young queens grew older, the strain often manifested in ways we might today recognize as profound mental illness. Some became withdrawn, reluctant to speak or participate in court life. Others grew suspicious, convinced that everyone around them was an enemy. Many lived in a state of perpetual paranoia, unable to trust even their closest attendants because betrayal was always possible, and kindness often fleeting. They were women who had been robbed of trust at the very beginning of their adult lives, and the wounds of that theft never fully healed. Their bodies had been claimed by politics, but so too had their minds. What began with a wedding night spectacle continued into a lifetime of control, a system that left them isolated, fearful, and broken. For them, queenship was not glory, it was imprisonment. Some of these young queens sought refuge in religion, turning their anguish into acts of piety that bordered on desperation. They spent endless hours on their knees in prayer, begging saints for deliverance, or threw themselves into punishing pilgrimages that placed their frail bodies in further danger. For them, faith was less about devotion and more about survival, an attempt to find meaning in suffering that otherwise had none. Others reacted differently, channeling their torment into control where they could find it. Stripped of agency in every great matter, they tightened their grip on the small, the domestic, the personal. They could not change their fates, but they could make life harder for those who made theirs unbearable. This, too, was a form of resistance. The most heartbreaking stories were those of queens who simply gave up. Court records speak in hushed tones of royal brides who stopped eating, who refused to speak, who wasted away in silence. Some sat for hours, motionless, staring at nothing as though the spark of life had gone out of them. These were not theatrical gestures, not attempts to garner sympathy or attention. They were the visible collapse of young minds that had endured more than they could bear. Children forced into queenship had no words for depression, no concept of trauma, but they lived armed. It's realities all the same, and so the terror they felt on their wedding nights was never just about the act itself. It was the recognition of what that act represented. They understood, with the keen instinct of the condemned, that this was not simply a night of humiliation or pain. It was the doorway into a life where nothing would belong to them again, not their bodies, not their choices, not even their thoughts. Everything that made them human, everything that gave them individuality, would be stripped away in service of dynasties and alliances forged by men who never considered their consent. These forgotten brides faced their wedding nights with the same grim courage as soldiers going into battle, knowing that survival was not guaranteed, and knowing too that even if they lived through it, they would never return unchanged. Their fear was not like the nervous excitement of a modern bride. It was the rational terror of children who knew, on some level, that they were being sacrificed, not to gods, not to monsters, but to politics. So the next time a medieval wedding is painted on screen with laughter and pageantry, remember the truth hidden behind the glitter. Remember Eleanor of Provence, trembling as she walked to her altar, knowing her childhood was ending. Remember Margaret Beaufort, nearly destroyed by childbirth before her body had even finished growing. Remember Isabella of Valois, 8 years old and sobbing for her mother in a court where no one spoke her language. Behind every crown was a frightened child who had been sold, stripped of dignity, and reduced to what her womb could provide. They deserve to be remembered, not just as queens or as names in dynastic charts, but as human beings who endured the unimaginable. Their wedding night fears were not weakness. They were warnings, rooted in the cruel truth of what lay ahead, and their ability to endure, evian. And when endurance meant nothing more than surviving another day, reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of history, the human spirit clings to life with astonishing strength,